Where did you grow up? I just have to know. It's nice every once in a while to have something that injects a tiny bit of humor into a city council meeting.
Boy, that's true.
Hey, Sam, you and I talk all the time.
Yes, sir, we do. We see a lot of each other.
But only on Zoom.
Yeah.
Looked like they had from the recording last night at the city council meeting, there were a number of people in the audience. I don't know how many, but
Our next meeting on Tuesday will be in City Hall, right?
yes, it's an actual meeting. I think, do you know how many people have said they're coming?
No.
Chris?
Well, Dave's got his mask on.
Yeah, Dave's got his mask on. And there he is, the chicken expert.
Roosters win again.
So did the city council pass it?
Yeah, they passed it. Lance, I thought you carried yourself with great dignity last night in spite of the humor.
Oh, hey, thanks so much. I was thrilled to have the opportunity to talk about chickens that crow.
Council member Stout lives next door to somebody who has keeps chickens in the city, and they have a hen that's taken on the male stuff and crows. So there was an interesting discussion about that.
Hi, everybody.
Hey, George.
Hi, George.
Tired of these virtual meetings.
Well, next Tuesday we get to do it again in real life.
Well, I thought we were having a live meeting.
We are. That's what I mean. We get to do it live next Tuesday.
Oh, that's good. I promise y'all I won't cough on you, but I'm not contagious.
Oh, we'll all be wearing masks, I'm sure. Director
Good
Allen,
afternoon.
I saw the city council recommend that you give Lance a raise last night because of his comportment on the chicken issue.
Yeah, we were gonna see if that thing would go viral today. Apparently it was very well received.
Oh, it was. I've gotten 3 different emails from 3 different council members saying, you've got to watch this.
Lance, you've taught us about all kinds of things about chickens.
It was a learning journey that we embarked upon together, and I think it went well.
He's very careful what he says. You notice that.
Good stuff.
So,
Tamara, have you heard from any of the other planning commissioners?
I believe Andrew did send in a response on Monday and let us know that he was not going to be able to join. But that is it. So we might, I'll look to you, Christian, but we might see if there's folks joining here in a couple minutes.
Who are we missing besides Andrew?
Ken.
No, Ken was here a minute ago.
Yeah, he was on.
I'll be right back. I got to get my lunch.
Okay, George. Yeah, go ahead, get your lunch. Yeah, Ken was here, so he'll be back. Tamara, do you anticipate, based on our agenda for Tuesday night, that we'll have the number of people in the audience?
Yes. Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see what kind of attendance we actually have. I was going to cover the agenda at the end of the meeting here. But I certainly can cover it at the beginning if that's the preference, either one.
So,
I think-
Tamara, are the items for Tuesday's public hearing posted on GJ Speaks yet?
They should be up. Yep. Let me.
Okay, I checked, they are up. I checked yesterday or the day before and there was nothing listed yet. So I think I was just early.
Yeah, so do you want me to just give you a brief highlight of the agenda you have for Tuesday?
That would be great.
Excellent. So
That was quite a packet, 554 pages. That took a while for you to do.
yeah, well, remember a fair bit of it is the applicant's information. So we've already combed through that and certainly nothing that we particularly generated, but there is a fair bit of information. And so you have a couple of projects on your agenda and your docket that certainly will, at least one of them, command probably an audience. So maybe we'll start with that one. So that is the Magnus Court Zone of Annexation and Outline Development Plan. You guys remember you saw this in March, I believe it was the end of March. And I believe it was actually the last hearing we had in person. Vote, but ended up tendering a recommendation of denial. I believe it was a 4-3 vote. So the applicant has actually withdrawn that initial application and has resubmitted a revised submittal, largely focused on new information that they've collected regarding the transportation infrastructure and some of the drainage elements related to that site. So most of it will look very familiar to you guys. And certainly, like I said, there's added information based off of their resubmittal for the request. So again, that one drew, I think, a fairly significant audience. I think we had about 20 or so speakers on that at the first hearing. So it'll be really interesting to see who shows up, and certainly will be really interesting actually to see who utilizes GJ Speaks for this. And Notice has obviously gone out and provided a link right to this site. So so moving on from there, unless there's any questions, you have a special district service plan.
Tamara, may I ask a question?
Cool.
I was a little surprised when I read the packet because there was some indication from in the original hearing that the county hadn't weighed in on anything. I was a little surprised to see that letter saying they'd contribute some money to a Safe to Schools thing. That was kind of not what I expected from the county, given their existing fiscal situation.
I'm not sure that I'll comment on that.
Yeah, since this is being streamed live on YouTube.
Well, I think that they have separate designated resources for safe routes to schools. It's actually a program, like
Yeah.
I think a nationally recognized program. So I think they had resources set aside in a pot for that, I would guess.
Yeah, and so
Thank you.
without getting into any level of specifics on the application, maybe a couple things. One, we have extended an invitation out to the county to actually attend. So we're hoping, we haven't received confirmation yet, but we're hoping they actually have a representative there that can speak to probably contents of that letter, should you all want information or otherwise. So do know that that has been extended. And we certainly can give you some information on some ongoing discussions and some information we've received from the county that may help inform the application, your conversation on that as well. So, any other questions or comments? So you also have a request for alley vacation. So this is, the request is part of the R5 block subdivision, which is an amended subdivision plat. This is right behind the R5 school, right downtown here on Grand and 8th, and well, 7th on one side, 8th on the other. and is part of the, or is related to the Lowell Village project. And if you guys have been by there recently, you'll see there's 4 relatively new townhomes that have been slowly cropping up. So this is part of that request related to their development proposal. And then there, you'll also notice there was notice, and you'll see on GJ Speaks, there's a title for one called Caleb Street Rezone. This was an application for a number of properties within an individual subdivision to come in for a rezone. They have actually withdrawn that application. They have a number of at least 1 or 2 additional property owners there that wanted to do the application. So you will likely see this back at one of your June hearing dates with additional proponents or applicants for the request. And then Redlands 360, this is a special district service plan. You may remember, it's actually been about 2 years ago now, I believe, since we had our first metropolitan district. So this is what we call a Title 32 metropolitan district. They're required under state statute to come through the city and request approval and consideration of what they call a service plan. You saw one relatively recently. This has been kind of a new phenomena for us for Lowell Village. So the project we just talked about there on Grand and 8th, right at the R5 school building, which was a really quite small one. And then we also saw one relatively recently for the Mosaic development, the proposed development off of 23 and just south of H Road. So there's criteria under the state statute about what the city has to look at in reviewing a service plan. That is all outlined obviously in your staff report. Your review and recommendation authority under our process and procedures, and then city council will ultimately review that service plan. You'll see there are a couple of conditions for this. One is that they actually have a approved development plan. So we do anticipate they'll be submitting for development plan review here this summer, and then it will take its course on making its way to hearing. And then secondly, they are required under state statute to form an IGA with the city, really outlining what the obligations are of the city and the metropolitan district when it comes to provision of service. So that's a high level review, but again, hopefully that criteria is spelled out fairly clearly, and hopefully you guys remember a little bit of that from your previous 2 applications for those that were actually on the commission when those came through.
Hey, Tamara, before we jump into our agenda for the workshop, will we have a different set of instructions for participants? Because I know we're going to have a staging area and that sort of thing. So I assume that will be different.
Yeah, so Bella has actually been working to perfect what that set of instructions are. We are approaching this as if it's really a true hybrid hearing that many of you, I think actually all of the planning commissioners have indicated that you will be present. However, we do have actually a couple of applicants that are not interested or available to be here in person for various reasons, amongst they can't actually travel here. And then we also certainly want to make that available to our public. So we're working on what that hybrid solution is. It may be a little bit clunky, but we're hoping that we're able to moderate it pretty efficiently. So notice did go out. We have a GoToMeeting link available to our public that they will be able to access, and we will likely utilize that same link for our applicants as well. So we'll work with you, Chairman Reese, to make sure we're moderating. We will likely have our staff helping moderate the physical kind of speaker exchange so that you can attend to your duties on the podium there or at the dais.
Okay, thank you.
So that's an overview of Tuesday's meeting. And at this point, unless there's any other questions on that, I want to turn it over to Lance Gloss to not talk about roosters this time, but to talk about landscaping. And so I want to maybe just give a little bit of an introduction to it. Hopefully you all were able to read. I think it's been several months now since I sent out a memo to you all. A similar memo went to council about a whole series of code amendments that we are looking at bringing forth. A number of them we have brought forth to you already, and then there's certainly some that are still in progress, landscaping being one of them. I want to talk maybe a little bit about priorities. One of the ways in which we've sorted through priorities are trying to find a variety of or identify a number of issues, areas obviously where there's inconsistency or there's confusion in our code, but certainly ones that we're seeing maybe a little bit of, I don't know if the right word is friction, but really opportunity to clarify and really improve our code that has really kind of lasting aesthetic impacts and other impacts, whether that be water usage or otherwise to our community. And so we've at a staff level identified the landscaping section as one that certainly could use some improvement to it, and maybe a little bit additional background as we actually started down this road about 2 years ago with when we had another previous planner. We had received a number of kind of issues and comments on our code sections and had made kind of we dipped our toe into modifications, but then with staff changes, have really just now started to take that opportunity to take a little bit broader approach to the landscaping code section, and certainly dovetails with some of Lance's skill and experience in this area as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lance to give you really just an overview of what our approach is and seek some discussion or guidance from you today.
Great, thanks, Tamara. I got a PowerPoint here, so I'll share my screen. But it looks like, I might not be allowed to do that right now. Shoot, can you ask Bella to give me presenter privileges? And while we're waiting on that, I'll just kind of give a little bit of background on, to elaborate on what Tamara was just saying. I think there are really two categories of things we're looking at here. One is, potentially tweaks to improve kind of the existing content and clarify. And then there's also, I think, a fair amount of opportunity to reach new goals as part of this process, and including the sustainability-related goals that are now obviously part of the strategic plan. So the hope is to try to balance those, and I'll kind of seek your feedback on that on the back end here. Let's see. So, and then a bit about me. I mean, obviously, I'm not a landscape architect, and we do not have a landscape architect on staff in this department. Some larger community development departments might, but this is an issue that is near and dear to my heart, and also is one that I've seen from a few different angles, having been commercial landscaping crews, worked in botanical archive, worked on land conservation issues. So hopefully can bring some added background to this. Just a current overview on how our landscaping code is structured at this time. Typically, it's applied during site plan and subdivision review. So site plans for anything non-residential or multifamily residential, that incorporates a review of a landscaping plan and attached irrigation plan. And then because single-family residences aren't reviewed for landscaping, all the single-family subdivision landscaping is reviewed at the time of plat, so that preliminary final or just final subdivision review. Our code breaks down the landscaping requirements by area. So, for example, at the street frontage, interior parking islands, parking perimeter strips, at the foundation plantings for buildings, etc. And it also takes a generally quantitative view. So the standards are largely expressed in terms of, how many trees per square foot, how many shrubs per square foot of developed area, per linear foot of street frontage, and then also the actual quality and type of shrubs and trees, et cetera, are also quantitative. So we rely on what's called a caliper measurement of a tree, which is basically a diameter measurement. And depending on whether it's an evergreen or an ornamental or a shade tree, we have a specific caliper that is a minimum size at the time of installation. Likewise, we have standards for what can be planted as turf. We have standards for the type of irrigation. We require permanent irrigation for any landscaping installed as part of a site plan or subdivision review. And then our landscaping code also covers fences and retaining walls. So that's found in this section of the code. One thing we don't have a lot of are supplements to this. So we have some kind of general homeowners maintenance guides that are available, and then the Parks Department keeps a list online of street trees that they will accept to be planted. And our code requires us to maintain a plant list of acceptable species from which any landscape architect working in the city is supposed to derive their choices. And if they choose something that's not on the list, they're, per the existing code, required to basically justify that, and then that needs to be approved by the director. And then from kind of an administrative perspective, at the end of all of this, once we have received and approved a landscaping plan approved by a licensed landscape architect, we then require a letter of completion for the install from that architect. And then we also require that the landscaping be maintained in perpetuity, which is, of course, something of a code enforcement challenge, kind of inherently, right? If our requirement is that we are demanding perpetual maintenance of landscaping throughout the city, in perpetuity. So that might not be something that's really solvable, and that's pretty common to require that, but I just wanted to flag that that's part of our requirement. So if you were coming in to do development in the city of Grand Junction and you stopped in for a general meeting on a Monday morning, this is the type of thing that you would see on your meeting notes and would be your kind of starting line for planning landscaping for your own development. And if you kind of skim through that, you'll see these key features. One, it's quantitative in many respects. Two, it's basically based on the type of landscaping. So you see there's frontage, there's a strip. I think in this one, and we don't have a parking lot in this description, but you can kind of see this is generally what people are working with, and we're asking them to turn these into plans. What we get back looks something like this. This is just a little sectional one. But of course, they show the locations of all of their plants, and then they've got pretty standard abbreviations which correspond in the key to their various species, and then usually their irrigation is planned either on this or on a utility composite or both. And the city planner is to review this and check it against the plant list and our other goals, and determine whether it meets our standards. So that's pretty much current practice. As Tamara said, we've gotten some kind of critiques on the code from some of our frequent flyers locally, and they had some critiques that basically focused on minor adjustments that would make their lives a little easier in terms of equivalencies. For example, our code allows you to exchange shrubs for turf in some areas, to exchange shrubs for trees in some areas. So they asked to clarify that. They asked for changes to the required minimum percentage of conifers. And they also had some comments on the caliper size of trees, which really got at the supply issues in the valley, which is that we have a limited number of suppliers of these plants. And if you're a landscape architect, you need to be able to actually access say, a 2-inch caliper shade tree when you say you need one. And so some had comments related to that. So there was kind of a staff report drafted in 2018, and that was not taken to hearing. So now, as we've gotten back into this question, I've reached out to about a dozen community members who are involved in various parts of the landscape industry. So we've got landscape architects, we've got people more on the conservation restoration side, suppliers, kind of third-party experts, including from the CSU Tri-River Extension, and then some of the other private sector install and maintenance crews to try to get a balanced perspective on the implications of the code. But most importantly, we are hoping to identify goals in this process, because as I said, there are a lot of different things that we can achieve, and we can try to achieve all of them, but my sense is that it will behoove us to prioritize right off the bat so we know what we're aiming for and what might be a lower priority. So,
Lance, can you talk about the Zurich bonus?
yeah, absolutely. So currently, our code makes a pretty cursory reference to Zurich. So basically what it says is that, let's see, it's called WaterWise, and it says that low water use plants are encouraged, and that landscaping designs that mimic the quote-unquote desert character of Grand Junction are also encouraged, but they also must meet the basic requirements for shade, screening, and buffering. Thus, the director must separately approve desert or Zurich landscape plans. And it also goes on that to encourage xeriscaping, we allow 1-gallon Zurich plants to be equivalent to 5-gallon non-Zurich plants. One of the inherent challenges here is that Zurich is a word that gets thrown around pretty commonly and doesn't necessarily have a consistent and reliable definition. What would be regarded as Zurich in some contexts is not Zurich in others. Oftentimes, people, instead of xeriscaping, do what's colloquially known as zero-scaping, which is where they just put a bunch of rocks down. If you've ever been to Phoenix, you've seen a lot of zero-scaping where there should be xeriscaping. So the proposal that came in with the Redlands in 2017-2018 was to create a more thorough Zurich bonus and allow landscape architects a little more creativity to propose Zurich plans. One of the challenges, I think, related to that is that we, as a planning department reviewing those plans, need to be able to evaluate whether or not that's a valid Zurich plan, which is a little more difficult to do than just counting trees and shrubs, as our code basically emphasizes right now. Does that help, Sam?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, sure.
Lance,
Yeah.
what would you define as a valid Zurich plan?
Well, I think fundamentally it needs to be it needs to be designed so that once the plants are established, say within 2 years, they no longer require irrigation. And that's kind of the Zurich ideal, is to create a landscape plan that does not require irrigation after establishment. Typically that's 2 years. And so again, that's kind of context specific. What would be Zurich here could require a little more water than what would be Zurich in Tucson, but would require, probably, well, you get the idea.
Yeah, I get the idea. Thank you.
Sure. So these are some goals that we could be pursuing, and I'm hoping to spend most of this time talking about which and to what extent, each of these is what we want to follow right here. A little bit of detail on each. I think evidently landscaping is a complement to the hardscape, right? So we have neighborhood plans that give kind of specific direction on what kind of landscaping is appropriate, for example, in the Redlands. A lot of other communities have their landscaping plans respond to the use of a given property, right? So that if you have an office use, there are specific landscape requirements meant at fostering an office use character. in different districts. So that would be one thing we could look at, and that would be almost an architectural approach. Another goal would be to enhance the flexibility of the code for designers. Because it's quantitative at this time, there's a limited amount of flexibility, and most of that flexibility comes in through those equivalencies that I mentioned. So, for example, you can currently exchange 25% of your shrubs for turf at a rate of 1 5-gallon shrub equals 50 square feet of turf, or you can exchange up to 10% of your shrubs for perennials at a rate of 1 5-gallon shrub equals 3 1-gallon perennials. So those are the kind of mechanisms we currently have for flexibility, and if we were to pursue that as a goal, I think we would look at enhancing those equivalencies, trying to think of new ones, and trying to simplify the way that they're presented so that they're more usable. The third one here is resource conservation, which is, I think, broadly construed as sustainability. I think the obvious one is water. Commissioner Scissors and I were at a workshop a couple months ago on that subject, and there's a lot of good guidance on how to form your landscape code so as to minimize water waste. But there's also other resource conservation possibilities there, and for example, I think shade as an emphasis is really common in hot places, right? And in some ways, it creates a trade-off with Zurich landscaping. Oftentimes, if you're seeking shade, you're looking to invest more water to reduce temperature and glare, and a Zurich landscape might be counter to that. So that's important to keep in mind. Another possible goal would be habitat, and that includes insect, bird, and mammal habitat, as well as arguably habitat for aquatic animals in certain contexts. And I think that's arguably a more challenging goal than some of the other ones, but it's certainly a goal that's been tackled in other communities, especially cities that have sought a pollinator-friendly designation. And I think, certainly birds are, prime targets for a habitat-oriented landscaping code. Another potential goal would just be accessibility and ease of use of the section, and really focusing an update on clarifying, simplifying, streamlining, and maybe even providing additional supplementary materials to developers, would-be developers, and landscape architects. And then another goal would be economic development, which really gets at the fact that landscaping is not only a feature of the urban form, but also an industry that employs people at many stages of that industry, and that a landscaping code could basically be used to improve the outlook for that industry in terms of working conditions, in terms of actual sales and revenue, in terms of keeping things local if that's a priority. And of course, there are other goals that could be introduced here. So I'm hoping now to just open the floor to discussion about which of these seems like the highest priority, which of them seem like a lower priority, and are there any goals that should be on here that aren't?
Lance, this is Christian. Just from my perspective, I think that flexibility for designers, for developers, for individual builders, I think is key when it comes to landscaping, commercial builders as well. I appreciate that we are in a desert climate, but I also think that if a homeowner wants to have a grass yard, they should not be disincentivized to have that grass yard. So I think flexibility, and then also certainly the economic development piece, are key in my estimation.
Lance, at one point I had heard feedback from developers that you had sort of tug and pull between, you'd submit, and I saw some of these where you'd submit landscape plans, and when you got comments back, you'd get all these negative comments from the police department, as an example, because putting shrubs in a walk, along a sidewalk or whatnot, were a place that evildoers could hide and jump out and attack. And while all those have merits, do you know if that is still occurring? And I don't know if it takes any change from the landscape code here, but while we're talking about landscaping, has that been addressed from a city perspective as far as what our goals are here? Are our departments conflicting with each other?
Hey, Keith. Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I'd also probably throw in transportation engineering into that conversation as well. The desire for visibility on the part of GJPD, while completely understandable, is not always super compatible with our requirements. It's landscaping, it's just stuff like enclosures for trash dumpsters. We require full screening. They require that there be a gap of like 6 inches at the bottom of the trash enclosure so you can see if anyone's standing in there. So I think there's a certain amount of inherent conflict, something we can explore and try to figure out if there are ways that we can move forward and enhance our achievement of our own goals and make sure that we take a positive step for police too. The reason I flag transportation engineers here as well is because there are site distance issues, particularly related to intersections, that street trees often run counter to. And if you take the kind of the best practice guidelines from your central transportation engineering textbooks, they're going to give you a distance between corner and the nearest street tree that would basically require the removal of hundreds of street trees in our community. So I think there's a certain amount of inherent conflict between those site distance desires for police and engineering, and then some of our goals related to urban form, conservation, et cetera.
Hey, Lance, this is George, and to kind of spin off what Christian and Keith said, when I first came on council, we had the big city market development plan going through on 12th.
Right.
And one of the things that it stood out in my mind was the sometimes we have rigid rules on the landscaping stuff, but sometimes in the real world, sometimes things work out better. An example of that was when they built when City Market did the 24 road store, they had a variance, or they got rid of the planter boxes right in the front, which tended to the people would trample over them, ruin the landscaping, and they were a disaster. And it also impeded some traffic flow. And we implemented that same plan over on the 12th Street City Market. So my point is exactly what Christian said. I think we need to have some flexibility, and I think we need to look at the landscaping, and either staff or us, but someone needs to look at it specifically for each plan too. I mean, you got to have guidelines, but maybe something that we have in code is not going to particularly work.
Mm-hmm.
And I would add to that, right now, small businesses and ongoing development is facing enough hurdles. And I would not be supportive of anything that makes development more restrictive into the future.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, this is Ken. Yeah, I'm generally in agreement with the direction of the other commissioners' comments. I actually did a small development out in the Redlands and bumped up against this very issue. So I really appreciate that we're looking to make some improvements in the way it's currently written. Our city is highly varied. We have areas there's still cows running around, and we have areas like my development and where I live right now, where it looks much more like county. it's just, it's literally desert out here, but then you go downtown, it's completely different. It's rose bushes and green lawns and big elm trees. So, and then commercial has the issues like George brought up. And so to me, the most important aspect of the flexibility is the flexibility to make a landscape plan that makes sense for where you are, that accomplishes specific goals specific to your site. In some places that may be privacy barriers and shade. At other places it may be the exact opposite, openness and continuity with nature. So I'm all for flexibility, but I just would say that the flexibility shouldn't mean just do whatever the heck you want. It should be flexibility to make a plan that makes sense in all these ways, in terms of fitting in with your environment and accomplishing some functions that we've mentioned here, and also being resource conservative. I would focus on what is the purpose of the landscape, what are you trying to achieve, and then I would think the flexibility would flow from there.
Yeah, I would simply like to say that I think that flexibility is absolutely critical, particularly with the larger developments. I think you have to do what Commissioner Scissors just said, which is get a plan for a particular development and see how logical it is for that specific development. One size does not fit all when it comes to landscaping. But I also believe that, because I happen to live in a subdivision that has very strict guidelines about resource conservation, that we have to at least, and I agree with Commissioner Reese's statement that we don't want to disincentivize a homeowner who wants a lawn. But we've got to acknowledge the fact that of all the landscaping things that we do around here, grass is the most water intensive environment we can create. And there are lots of parts of the West that don't necessarily disincentivize. They simply say lawns can be a maximum of such a percentage. And if you don't put lawn in and you do some kind of a xeriscape water managed landscaping, there may be some bonus that comes in terms of a refund from the city or something of that nature. I don't want to disincentivize people who want a lawn for their kids, but I think we have a responsibility to also to conserve the one resource that we know we're going to have problems with as we grow.
Well, and keep in mind here that the landscape code, and please, Lance, correct me if I'm out of date, but when we're talking about lawns and everything else, we're not dictating the code. When I say we, the code is not dictating people's individual properties and yards and whatnot. That's often left to HOAs may choose to impose certain rules there. So we're really talking about the open spaces, how we maintain stormwater detention areas, the landscape strips along right of ways,
Right.
Trail corridors, those things. So, maintenance plan of that seems to be, in my opinion, kind of the important one, because and I guess that's inherent to an ultimate priority of that flexibility thing, to let them mass up certain landscaping here or not do it there in methods that make sense, rather than just a per X amount of linear foot you have to have this. So that flexibility to locate it on any given site based on what buffers or open spaces that end up being under the control of either the HOA or in a commercial entity, the overseeing entity that owns it, or that ends up being right away that gets converted over it. I do think that that's really important. Lance, I'd also like to know if there was any conversation that influenced how we're treating things such as, one would be the detached sidewalks and how landscaping can exist in between those, and who is ultimately responsible for that. For example, if you've got a detached walk and that's now within the right of way, did any of that conversation come up? Because I often hear about how developers and people want to see more detached walks, and they'd be willing to do so if there weren't the impacts economically, both upfront and ongoing, for the landscaping maintenance and what you can and can't have as far as trees in that ground between detached walks and sidewalks. Was there any conversation about that might apply to any adjustments we're making to a landscape code?
Yeah, Keith, just circling back, I mean, first of all, you're correct that this section of the code does not apply to single-family residential lots. Other communities do have kind of another section of their landscaping code that is meant to apply to that and can do things like limit turf. But currently, this is written such that the entire section does not apply in any way, shape, or form to single family or duplex lots. To your question about that detached walk, that area which we call a park strip between the sidewalk and the street is the responsibility of the developer to install and maintain. And our code basically, except in some circumstances, basically none or only part of that park strip landscaping is allowed to count toward your requirement for street frontage landscaping. So if you have to dedicate a bunch of right-of-way as your project is coming through our development review process, and that right-of-way is not going to be immediately developed into road, then basically you are responsible to landscape and maintain that park strip as well as a 14-foot street frontage strip behind the sidewalk. So you're right. I think there's an argument to be made that is working counter to our strategic desire for detached walks in some places, right? Because, for instance, North Avenue, is a plan Dave's really familiar with. We require everybody to create that detached walk, but then at the same time, they're faced with landscaping requirements almost above and beyond. So that has not been part of the conversation at this point, Keith, but it's certainly something we could look at if we're trying to focus this on flexibility and positive improvements for developers. It's a good point.
Well, I might add, one thing that the code does do with a detached walk is it reduces the 14 feet to 5 feet. So they do have a smaller strip of landscaping requirement on the inside of the walk, not the park strip side, but the other side. So there is some incentive there in the sense of the detached walk. But the property owner is going to be required to maintain the park strip. The only exception is North Avenue, where the city's taken over those sections along portions of the corridor and is ready to do that for the entire corridor as that develops out long term.
Yeah.
So one other question was, when it comes to multifamily, if I recall correctly, we have requirements of a certain square footage of landscaping. And can you help me? Is that square footage of lawn in particular versus shrub bed? Because it's on a per bedroom basis, right? And I know certainly in infill projects that we've looked at in the past, that requirement for both parking and for landscaping ends up being a very significant driver for the amount of density you can actually get. So do we know if that is still?
Keith, yeah, so it's not per bedroom. It's all driven by the total development area. So in that respect, if you go taller on the same footprint with your building, you're not going to have a higher landscaping requirement because of that. However, it is a quantitative requirement based on the development area, and it is expressed in terms of square footage of square footage of turf, number of shrubs, number of trees, diversity of trees, location of all of these things. But it's on a square footage of the development area basis.
So there are a couple areas in our community where we've reduced landscaping through the overlay method, which is the greater downtown plan, obviously downtown. We don't expect people in the E2 area of downtown, when you build a building, you're not required to put in the commercial type of landscaping you would have to do if that same building was located on 6th and 50 out by Mesa Mall, for example. The other overlay is the opt-in overlay with North Avenue, where you can actually reduce the amount of landscaping that's required in a C1 zone by opting into the standards, bringing your building up to the edge of the right-of-way or within 10 feet if it's a pedestrian type hardscape space in between the building and the sidewalk. And it basically reduces about 50% of the required landscaping. So the only landscaping in those situations are going to be parking lot type landscaping, the perimeter around the parking lot that's to the rear of the building, or islands in a parking lot. So the end result is that they can reduce their landscaping by quite a bit by opting into that overlay standard and bringing their building up close to the street.
Mm-hmm.
But those are kind of our exceptions to the rule when you look at the entire commercial zoning in our community. So it kind of comes back to what, I can't remember who said it, but just how, creating landscaping by area in town. Maybe there's other ways to approach this.
Sure, and the Redlands neighborhood plan calls for a Redlands specific landscaping standard, and that was not implemented. But it could, we could explore that district by district, and that brings up another point, Keith, which is that if infill projects are being stymied by landscaping requirements that are too restrictive and make those developments unfeasible, arguably, and you could debate whether it's desirable, but arguably you could use relief from the landscaping code in certain areas to try to incentivize infill in that area. So if we said, say 7th Street corridor from downtown to Las Colonias, we want to see infill there, and we want to see a Main Street-like environment developed there. Maybe you create an overlay for that area or you amend the overlay for that area to reduce landscaping requirements and maybe change setbacks or something. So this could be used to achieve a lot of different goals.
Then my last comments, I think, more directing towards your particular questions of this list. What would be high goals versus low goals? I think I've identified the high goals. I think the low goals that I would have is that accessibility, ease of use, and I'm basing that on, when we try to make every little subdivision have a little pocket park or something like that, it just ends up being something that's too small or too, uneconomically feasible for the developer to create of any real value. It just sort of ends up being somebody checked the box. And my concern would be that the same thing could happen with those landscape corridors, especially when we put so much emphasis on our other parks and corridors with even the fees associated for open space fees and things of that nature. The habitat scenario, though, I would throw out as just topic for conversation, not an action item here, but in the same manner that there was talks and an effort to try to create either wetlands banks or stormwater banks for projects that got into those areas and needed to replace small wetlands along the way. Different habitat banks in areas that the city has deemed very appropriate. As an example, Las Colonias might be one of those areas, other parks, other areas that perhaps it could be a fee in lieu of to habitat banks for some landscaping. I think that could make sense. And heck, if we get real visionary or progressive, and especially in light of COVID's effect on supply chains, and local food production and urban food production becomes something that our communities start to hang on to. That's sort of incentivization to pay fees in lieu of to contribute towards those sorts of things for a community could prove to be effective. Thanks.
Thanks, Keith. George, you're muted.
Yep.
Okay, as a humorous thing on the habitat, I wanted to caution you about something. When I was on city council, we had problems with prairie dogs, and we
Oh, yeah.
got our solution was to get a company to come get a huge vacuum truck and vacuum these prairie dogs up, and then we transplanted them to other communities. So be careful of the habitat you want.
Yeah, those prairie dogs, they can be a real nuisance, and yeah, I think we want
And
to.
we don't want them coming here from the urban sprawl on the eastern slope.
This is the
Absolutely
western
not.
slope, George. We don't have vacuums. We have 30-06.
That's
I
right.
know. It's much better, much more efficient, and a lot better cost efficiency.
Because you remember in the hearings with City Market at 12th Street, there was the neighbors that were concerned about all of the animals on that plot of land, so.
Right.
Yes, if you'll remember, they said there were deer and all sorts of things on that plot of land.
Yeah, and one thing that I'll just throw out here on the dimension of habitat, I think there's a lot of ways to construe that, and it's important to remember a couple things. One, that we're not just talking about mammals, and so that there are a lot of interventions on a species choice level that can have really big impacts for insects and birds, and that's something to think about as we look at a plant list, and as we look at what we require, or maybe what we require if someone wants to take advantage of relief in one place, ways that they can make up for that. And then the other thing to keep in mind is that, we are surrounded by a massive amount of public land that is inhabited by a variety of large mammals that are want to enter developed areas, right? So mountain lions, coyotes, deer, these are all species that have thrived on suburbanization nationwide. And long term, we're going to want to probably address how we think of that, what's called the urban wildland interface, and how we think about large mammal impacts too. So that might be a separate thing, but certainly something we could consider as part of this process.
So there's a lot there. I think considering the time, thank you guys for your comments. I think that you all have really good observations here, and certainly provided us some good direction on where to go related to the specific goals. So as Lance noted at the very beginning, this is more than just a kind of staff exploration and then recommendations to you all. We're taking a much broader approach to this, and as Lance indicated, really trying to bring a fairly significant size working group together to help provide some feedback and critique of the actual landscaping code and how we can improve it and meet a variety of different goals. So wanted to make sure that you guys were certainly aware of this, and certainly provide your input here on the front end. I think from this point forward, we will convene this working group or technical group, if you will, and then provide you guys updates as that conversation progresses through probably goal establishment, and then ultimately through a draft revision for you all to take a look at. So we'll certainly be checking in and welcome your input throughout the process.
Canberra,
Mhm.
does the working group have any representation from the Planning Commission, or is it just an industry working group?
As we've set up right now, it's kind of industry, but it's a fairly big breadth, and Lance, you can add to that. Certainly it's not limited. So if there is someone that would like to volunteer to participate, I think we'd be happy to have someone participate and be obviously a conduit back to the Planning Commission as a whole.
Keith did the last one. I think we should let Keith do it again, don't you, Christian?
I am happy to if I'm representing well.
Okay, Keith, I'll add you to correspondence on that then, and just a note, also the city forester is involved, so that should be another good point of contact for parks and such.
You represent the planning commission well on everything you do.
Here we go.
All right.
Hey, Keith, we'll give you an extra payday bar.
Yeah.
Just whatever you do, don't nominate me for the chairman. That's for sure. I'm out on that.
Oh,
I know what
I'll
you're
give
trying
you.
to butter me up for here, Christian.
I'll give you my payday bar if I get one Tuesday.
Good job with your presentation, Lance.
Hey, thanks,
Yeah.
Tim.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
Do we
very
have
good work.
any-
So,
Sorry.
Yep, so that's all I had. I did want to just give you a heads up. We haven't been able to make connection with either Steve or Kathy. If a couple of you remember, probably at the last meeting, we'd tried to invite them in through our Zoom function to thank them for their service. So in substitute of that, we will have a couple cards for you, especially for those attending in person on Tuesday, for you to sign, and then we will deliver them with plaques to both Kathy and Steve for their service here. So feel free to come prepared if you have some notes or comments you'd like to specifically include in those cards. Those will be on the dais circulating there before the meeting.
I think we're all coming, aren't we, Tamara?
That's what I've heard, which is great.
Tamara, are we required to wear masks during the public hearing as planning commissioners?
That's a great question. So yes, please do plan on wearing a mask. How the council has been managing that is we actually have you spread out fairly far on the dais. When council is speaking, most of them will pull the mask down so that the audio is much more clear, and then most of them slip it back up when they're done speaking. So I would suggest the same if that's if you all feel comfortable in that realm.
We should have a contest for the most colorful mask.
We don't mean
I'm coming with
verbally
a
colorful.
Chewbacca Max then.
Yeah. So, anything else before we adjourn?
Nope.
Great.
Well,
Well, we
good.
look forward to seeing you guys all in person on Tuesday. So appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great
Thanks.
weekend.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
So, can you go back to your slide on the list?